Hello everyone, welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. If there's a topic you'd like us to cover on the show, feel free to email us at fromnowheretonothingpodcast@gmail.com or contact us on our Facebook page. Last week, we began the examination of our namesake by looking at the abstraction of nowhere. This week, we'll follow up by probing an equally amorphous topic. Philosophers and scientists have long said that nature abhors a vacuum. And to this day, physicists have found ways to fill that vacuum with quantum fields and frothing particles. So if a vacuum state has remained elusive throughout history, does this mean that a total lack of matter and energy is impossible? Today, we're looking into the gaping maw of nothing. So
I'm looking into the gaping maw of the Mandalorian helmet that's sitting on the stand over here and seeing these very interesting twirling circles because it's taking the reflection from the light in this room and messing with the blinds, and it's almost hypnotic.
Yeah.
That doesn't exist.
No,
That's just nothing.
Yeah, it's imaginary. So what is nothing?
I'm going to laugh a lot today because this is fraught with the peril of puns intended and otherwise and reversals. What is nothing? The absence of something. Well, I'm not being.
What is nothing? Nothing isn't.
Nothing isn't, because there can't be nothing, because if nothing exists as a word, one is quantifying or formulating a concept of a space which implies boundaries, which means something is around the nothing, so nothing can be found. What is a black hole?
So we'll say what is nothing for the end.
Okay.
We'll go in reverse order.
I didn't do the right thing.
We'll go in the reverse order. So what do you want to explain what Parmenides and those he influenced thought about nothing? We'll start at the beginning.
Okay. So nothing. I'm trying. Yeah, it's not. I've been practicing this too. I've been talking to myself about this week. Is no thing, but the idea is that it's an unidentifiable thing. That not that it doesn't exist, but that it's like nowhere is implied a space, but a space that we haven't bothered to get to know or to understand, or as we talked about last week. So nothing is something that is not extant to any degree. It's something that is not identifiable, or something that later down the line, but we start with Parmenides, but down the line it becomes, we toss about things like, well, what's bothering you? Nothing. We don't want to talk about it. So it's a stand-in. So it's a stand-in for something. It's a placeholder.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, in early physics, like we're about to talk about, it was sort of kind of the same thing without them knowing it, really. But,
Right.
So yeah, there's sort of two positions on it. The one starting with Parmenides and the other one starting with Aristotle. But Parmenides, essentially kind of took up the position that nothing exists because we can conceptualize it, or
Nothing
even if
not exist.
Yeah, even if we can't conceptualize it necessarily, we are aware of the idea of nothing, so nothing must exist.
Yes.
Right?
The very part of the idea of putting a word boundary around it. And I like that. I think Parmenides was right. Because to jump to another thing I just said, so I'll try to keep connected, I promise, is if someone asks you, what's bothering you, and you say nothing, what you're doing is saying, I don't want to talk about it, or I don't want to give more attention to it. It's rather like trying to look at the Pleiades in the sky at night. If you try to stare directly at the Pleiades, most nights you're not going to see it. But if you look out of the corner of your eye, that's where so much horror fiction comes from. The idea there's nothing there, is there?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think Parmenides was right from the get-go.
Yeah, and throughout time, there's been a lot of philosophers that have backed him up. Plato and all the way through to, even Einstein's sort of ideas of physics kind of back up Parmenides. So,
yes.
But Aristotle and Descartes, and among others, kind of served as a foil to Parmenides' line of reasoning. You want to kind of talk about what their counter argument was?
Because it seems to be vastly different, but when you get down to it, so Descartes talking from the scientific viewpoint and the vacuum and just another connection. Remember, we talked about somebody else fairly recently,
Pascal,
who changed the idea of because a vacuum exists. So a vacuum is initially a space in which nothing, no molecules, no air, no anything. But, and that's where you start. But then as physics progresses, one finds that there are things, particles, which we actually can capture occasionally, like the God particle. Oh my gosh. and that dark matter may be this goopy thing that's filling space, and although we can't see it. And so just in that brief, ridiculous sentence, there are like 3 different kinds of nothing, and so.
Yeah. So, yeah, the listeners, you might have a hard time sort of conceptualizing this, but so Parmenides is saying, nothing exists because we can conceptualize it. And then you have, Aristotle and Descartes and these other people looking at vacuums, Pascal looking and saying, well,
yes.
Yeah, but vacuums exist. And then, and other philosophers fighting against saying, no, like vacuums don't exist. There's ether. There's this other thing that fills it. No, you can't, you can't have anything there's no space where there's nothing.
But if you don't know, and this is where Descartes going from too, if you don't, if you say, I don't know, and you say, I think something is there, but it seems to be nothing, the vacuity itself is useless as a concept as far as is concerned, in the sense that it doesn't tell us anything. If we get stuck on vacuum, and it's okay, but we're not providing character. We're not developing the thought until down the line, past them, the Einstein, and then wade into A.J. Ayers and Bergson and other philosophers who are examining the more the etymological, metaphysical concept.
Yeah, and so. Ether, this idea of, something filling the void that we consider to be nothing, is an ancient concept, but it's still one, like what I was talking about in the intro, where even today, right, physicists say that there's no such thing as empty space. You have fields and particles that pop in and out of existence constantly. So is there nothing? Is there ever nothing? It becomes a very sticky topic. So, but those are kind of the two ancient positions. Is that, nothing exists in theory, but it doesn't exist, practically. And then there was the other, Pascal and some of the other ones that were saying, well, no, we can create a vacuum, and there's nothing there, and
then they and then it's not framed by, but sort of the Venn thing again, the Venn diagram, it intersects with nothingness. And whether we're talking about scientific nothing or religious, theologically focused nothing. I mean, in ancient mythology, chaos was nothing. So, and you think chaos, and the first thing in one's mind, in my mind, chaos was never nothing.
Yeah, chaos seems to me like if you were to try to narrow it down, do you think there'd have to be two things that are interfering with each other randomly? To me, that seems to be sort of a working definition of chaos in the way that we conceptualize it, right? You have to have at least two different things that are interacting with each other in a unpredictable way.
But that's very scientific, isn't it? And if you're going to, in the beginning, there was nothing. We're back to what we talked about with nowhere, with the singularity popping, but now that's scientific, but there's also, creation ex nihilo, something out of nothing. But even in Norse mythology, Ginnungagap, actually the word gap is associated with nothing and chaos. So we've got a gap between things. Does that mean there's nothing there? I mean, what happens on you've studied so thoroughly, are studying so thoroughly to the terminal degree in psychology. What happens in the physiology of the brain between synapses?
Yeah, there's so none of your neurons touch, so you have this empty space between neurons, and then you have chemical neurotransmitters that go from one, axon to the other dendrite in the synapse.
When I was a kid, they talked about it being like lightning zipping from one thing to another, but it's more chemical.
Yeah.
But still, there's that gap.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not trying. I don't think I'm taking us off track. I just think that if we think about other, and philosophers started, small group of philosophers started actually playing with the word, which I love, but so they call it noth, and it becomes a verb. So I'm nothing if I'm talking about nothing. So I'm playing with noth.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a very difficult thing to conceptualize, and throughout history they've thought about this. And Hegel dialectically synthesized the concept of everything and the concept of nothing as the act of becoming. Does that seem to ring true to you, or what was he thinking when he was?
No, I think that is true. But Hegel, later Bergson, in the early 1900s, talking about this idea of how does something come out of nothing? Must there be some seeds? Must there be things there that can expand into what we know, or is it truly just empty? I think that there's a fright factor in humanity. We are seemingly scared most of that which completely doesn't exist. And I suppose if you put your head into it, and I think this is partly what I think Hegel and Bergson are working on this. So or even Nietzsche, if you stare into the abyss, what is an abyss? A great big crack in the world, a great big canyon, open, but worse than that, dark. What happens when we stare down into the ocean? A complete darkness. If you stare into space and they're in a place where there's seemingly, with the unaided eye, there's nothing. There's just a negative space. That seems to be unacceptable to our brains.
Yeah, because our everyday experience is predicated on causal factors, right? So things come from other things. And the very idea of nothing, whether we ascribe it to what happened before the universe, or what happens to our consciousness after we die, or whatever other conceptions of nothing we have, the idea breaks that causal chain, right? Where all of a sudden there's no first domino that sets the rest of them tipping, or there's no last domino to get tipped over and the motion ends. And that doesn't, it doesn't concatenate with our everyday experience.
No, and Bergson was talking about this too. So and pointing out why it doesn't quite follow it. If you say, oh, well, nothing is what's left when you annihilate everything. So it's predicated on an annihilation that leaves a nothing. But that doesn't quite work, because then you'd have to say, well, there was something before there was nothing. And we like to say there was nothing and then there was something. And how can that happen?
Yeah. And so I think that Hegel probably would disagree with Burke's too, right? Because this idea of everything and nothing synthesizing to becoming generally moves in the direction from nothing to everything.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Do you think that is that necessarily true? If you were going from everything to nothing, is that also a form of becoming, or is that unbecoming, or how would you?
It's unbecoming for us to talk about that. Yeah, but I love it. No, it's do I think that?
Because so I think that in a lot of cases we're thinking metaphysically here, but we can apply this to people, right? Mm-hmm. So, hey, I don't remember anything before I was born. As far as my consciousness is concerned, there was nothing. And so now I'm becoming a human being, right? But at some point, and it's not a monolithic or a singular circumstance. It's, it'll affect different parts of the brain and body differently. Mm-hmm. But at some point there will be an undoing, right? And that happens in stages. Some from the time you're born, some from the time you're a late teenager, some from the time you're a middle adult, some not until the very end of your life. But there is always going to be that undoing that will send you back towards nothing. So is that
becoming?
Is that a different? Are you constantly becoming, or when you start to become undone, is that a different concept?
I think that it's the first. I think it's to this extent, because when you get to be of an age where you're starting to think of the unraveling, there's the potential. Excuse me. There's the potential for something to come of what's there. I mean, I think most people know this now, but just a little warning: if I say something here that sounds just a little gruesome, I don't think of it as gruesome, but there are people who are going to have their bodies, they arrange to have their bodies taken to special acreage where the body can just lie and decompose upon their death. And I think the FBI has a special place to do that, to study forensic. But the unbecoming, the unraveling of the body then mingles with the dirt, things that people have said to their progeny for eons, become one with the soil. And then the soil becomes other things. Our molecules become part of the air. And do we then reform as something else? Well, if we believe in some of the basic laws of physics, then probably. So to answer that, I'm not trying to do a long answer, but I think for me, there is something coming out of that unraveled nothing. And so it's a process, and it's
complicated, I think, because, it's human nature to think about it from the ego state, right? To think of my life as being the singular event.
Yes.
There was nothing before my consciousness. So when my consciousness ends, there is nothing again.
Yes.
But objectively, in reality, that's not the way it works. And we've talked about this in the past with the hero's journey, right?
Mm-hmm.
When in works of literature, the hero's journey focuses on the hero.
Right.
But in real life, each hero has a multitude of heroes' journeys going, and every character that you interact with in real life is also a hero with multiple heroes' journeys. And so, in one journey, I'm the hero, and another one, I'm the wise old man, and another one, I'm the villain. And not only that, but in different scenarios, I have different roles that I play, and I'm in different parts of the journey, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when you extrapolate that to the world as a whole, it kind of takes into account what you were saying. I may not have, there was nothing before I was born. There's nothing after I die. But yeah, after I die, and they've done this. They've figured out the constituent elements of the human body, right? All right, if you take away all the water, here's the weight in minerals that the human body is made out of, right? And it decomposes and it gets made into other things, right? Plant matter or bacteria or other things like that. The same way that other things had to die or be transformed. Our mothers had to eat things and metabolize them in order to turn them into us, right? So it's all just part of this constant thing. And consciousness is just a very small part of that. This really does reintroduce this idea of nothing again, right? If we're thinking about nothing from the singular ego state of one individual, that's a completely different concept than thinking about nothing on the whole.
Totality. Yeah. I think, and that's what eventually we get from Hegel to Sartre. And Sartre writes being and nothingness. And Sartre is the one, Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist, who says that the idea of nothing is a great nauseation for a person to confront, or a source of deep anxiety. And so the idea of non-existence is what troubles people. Even though we came from non-existence, non-existence is on both sides of us. The phrase, I was talking to my wife about this yesterday. It was some goofy advertisement on the radio, and it said, our services are end-to-end services. And I'm saying, what? There's no beginning? But that's a business phrase, isn't it?
Yeah.
End-to-end. What are you talking about? Where is it? Is this the worm or Ouroboros eating itself? But that's what human life is. End to end.
Yeah. So we have, Hegel's dialectic argument there. And then you brought up Sartre, which is great because, Sartre does sort of naturally extend from that in the Western world. But I think that some of the listeners might be wondering, okay, well, when you hear Hegel's dialectic argument, where you have the thesis of everything, I think he puts it as the absolute being everything. Yep. And then, the antithesis of the absolute being nothing, and then the synthesis being becoming. That sounds awfully Eastern, right? What is the difference? Between what Hegel was saying and what some Hindu or Buddhist or Taoist philosophies think about when they consider nothing?
I think arguably it's an application of logic that is not required. And this capital R rational is not necessarily required in the. I'm saying this is one very incomplete and raggedy practitioner of yoga, as an example. One thinks, but then one feels. One goes intuitive, and we know that intuition has been found to be a kind of intelligence or an intellectual process too. But nonetheless, I think that if you're putting the two things together, Hegel would seem much more rhetorically structured as opposed to a Zen koan. What is the sound of one hand clapping kind of thing? You're going to think about it, you're going to process it, but then you're going to get past the thinking about it and just say, "Oh."
Yeah. So I think in the Eastern philosophies and religions, the nothing is, I think that it is more ego based, right? You're attempting to cultivate that experience of nothing within yourself. And what's interesting about that is that, there's, now with our scientific imaging and studies, we can examine what's going on in people's brains, and there's actually physical changes taking place in the brains of people who experience this type of nothing, right?
Well, and you're right. The ego is bound up in what some Eastern philosophies concentrate on, but just this too goes back to one of our previous conversations, in the sense of, can one be utterly objective, which would be to drop all ego and just to observe things as they are, and I think that there's a correlation between that and the idea of the egoless state, which is the ultimate state that one tries to perhaps reach in some Eastern philosophies. But we know, I say know carefully, that it's very, very difficult to reach a fully objective, maybe even impossible to reach a fully objective a state of intellectuality when you're dealing with a concept. The emotions and sooner or later do seem to kick in, or the associations one makes. And so that's the connection. That's the connection between the two. But I think I still would say that Hegel is much more argumentatively structured, as opposed to the Eastern, which says, I'm oversimplifying that, not just do it, but clinging.
Yeah.
And Hegel's not saying quit clinging. Hegel's saying find the meeting place. There's a different message there.
Yeah, I think that sums it up. There's a different message. And, maybe the one that would be closest to what Hegel is talking would maybe be Taoism.
Yeah.
Because Taoism, again, it is highly intuitive, but essentially the idea there is that your language is incapable of capturing what nothingness is. But it's something that, and everything comes out of it. It's something that it was always there. It's still always there. It's this. So I think that it's an intuitive way of sort of conceptualizing the more rational argument.
So in Taoism, I often think in the Eastern, and Hindu text as one example where there's an inhalation and an exhalation. It's all very organic. Hegel does not talk in the sense of an organic universe, but what you just said took me to that, because existence comes out of the exhalation. The inhalation is non-existence. You exhale and out comes stuff.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's interesting to look at the different paradigms. But so, can and does nothing exist? I mean, we attempted very clumsily, right, to look at the historical, conception, and I think just again, sort of recap, Parmenides and Democritus and Plato and Aristotle, these guys, they were thinking about, not in modern physics terms, but they were thinking about the fact that everything in the world is made up of atoms. And if it's completely filled, right, then there can be no anything. But if there is no nothing, then how does anything move? Is motion possible? And they come to the conclusion, well, yeah, motion's possible if you're using stuff to move other stuff out of the way, but there's still nothing, right? So it was simplistic and was rudimentary back then. I mean, it was very advanced for back then. But now, looking at it now, we think of it as simplistic or rudimentary.
Yeah.
But has our modern conception of physics or the philosophies that have thought about it since then, have we moved much beyond that in terms of determining whether or not nothing does exist or can possibly exist?
I think we're starting oddly to come full circle, or if not for full circle, we're going up the spiral again. The etymology is always interesting. You know that. I find it just, and I know we didn't start with etymology because I knocked us like a billiard ball. But the Latin, there's a word, nihilium. And the one smaller particle, ne or ne, N-E, means not. Helium means a trifle. Nothing or nothingness literally comes out of a word that means not a trifle. In other words, it is a very not trivial thing. And I think we're arriving at that. Quantum physics, metaphysics, I think we're coming to what the original concept or part of the original concept was.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that there's still these questions that we can ask ourselves that physics and science don't help us out with, right?
And Shakespeare does. When
you say, all right, well, everything, there was a big bang, right? Now, an infinite point of matter and energy that expanded. Well, what did it expand into? Right? Where did it,
expand into nowhere?
Right. Yeah. Where there was nothing, right?
Was nothing.
So as far as science and physics go, they say, well, that's a nonsense question to even ask, right? It doesn't mean anything.
But psychologically, in humanity's terms, and I'm serious about this with Shakespeare, I think if you pair it not parrot like the if you pair it with the science, I think interesting things can come of that. For instance, in no particular order, but if for those who are familiar with Shakespeare, or maybe you can re-access those frightening days of being in school and having to read it. King Lear asks his three daughters, to tell him how wonderful they think he is, and he's going to cut his land in 3 parts and give the most to the daughter who tells him most. It's a ridiculously egoistic, talking the Eastern, act, an arrogant act, and one daughter holds forth, and the next daughter holds forth even more, and he carves up his map and gives those, and the third daughter essentially says, "I have nothing to say," and Lear says, "Nothing comes from nothing. Speak again." In other words, that wasn't the right answer, daughter. You better say something good about me. But nothing comes from nothing.
Yeah, it's interesting because that kind of correlates with the mathematical concept of dividing by 0, right? It's sort of, and that I think that is the existential, to get back to Sartre, right? The existential anxiety associated with nothing is this idea that causal relationships break down. What happened at the beginning and what happens at the end don't make sense because you divide by 0 and you don't have anything that comes from it, right?
Right.
And so you're in this state of constant questioning as a human, because everything in our experience has a causal factor.
And thus the titular, meaning the title, the name, this part of the name of what we called this podcast is about that very thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
You have to question everything, and ultimately, existentially, you make meaning for yourself at that moment, but it may be a transitional or transformational or transactive meaning.
Yes, all answers are tentative.
And then there's Macbeth. Nothing is but what is not.
That's a good one.
All right. So now we get into the deeply psychological, and we don't have to rehash the whole story of Macbeth, but this is a person who has been convinced by witches, by voices, perhaps from the interior. It's directed all kinds of ways and it's interpreted all kinds of ways. But I like to think of it as psychological. Maybe the universe is pushing a little bit. Nothing exists but what doesn't. The things we weave in our head about our experience in life is not necessarily what actually happened.
Mm.
And so there's I think it acknowledges the ultimately subjective, and this, if not trap or prison, this very difficult space we are in our own heads, where in some ways it's kind of like the light trying to emerge from a black hole, or a photon bouncing around in the sun for 1 million years until it comes out. We are blocked by our own perceptions as much as we are aided by our own perceptions. We have to find our way out. And so nothing is but what is not is a really powerful, potent thought to me.
Yeah. Yeah. And you said something there that gives me a different sort of anecdote or vision of it, right? When we ask, can or does nothing exist? And we consider the philosophical and scientific evidence that we have, it seems very difficult to try to say that it does. But like an analogy, right, is that if you ever have any light, darkness disappears, but darkness still exists, right? You can still
campfire.
You can still have a situation in where there's no photons. And so I feel like nothing is the same way. Yes, sure. Anything automatically dispels nothing, but nothing having no thing, to me, it does seem like it could exist if not in our past or in our future, in another universe, it could. Mm-hmm. You know, as a matter of fact, it's probably statistically much more likely. And it's funny because they have arguments about this, right? Multiverse arguments, where they say it seems much more likely that there'd be many universes that had nothing in them. But then they said, well, actually, you could only have one universe that has nothing. Because if you had any more, strange stuff happens.
Okay.
So
nothing becomes everything. This is where this really cool inversion happens.
Yeah.
If it's no thing, as in no identifiable single thing, well, then it must be.
Yes, because
everything.
If you had multiple universes that had nothing in them, then you'd have two universes that had nothing, and two universes would be a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Would be multiple things, right? And this is, we've talked about in the past Roger Penrose's idea of a cyclical universe, and how if things get spread out enough so that there's nothing, the mathematics is the same as an infinitely dense point of space, right? So there's this sort of cyclical thing that, again, is represented intuitively in Taoism.
Yes,
and
the
rationally.
Eastern philosophies are about the cycles.
Yeah.
Or even, I won't pretend to hold forth about Hinduism as a religion, but in some of the conceptual it's a cycle.
And that's why I think it's interesting to look at Hegel's dialectic argument and specifically the idea of becoming, right? Because when we were thinking about becoming over the human life and that question of, is the motion throughout life from birth to death all becoming? Or when you start to decline, does becoming change into something else? Does becoming change into decline, right? Because, then, because I think that affects the cyclical nature of the conception, right? It's difficult to think about that way, but yeah, what is becoming would be another good episode.
It would, and I think we probably should. But I'm glad you're dwelling on Hegel because his assertion, his finding in the dialectic, nothing, everything in between, becoming is a process. Becoming is into the future, and becoming has this connotation of positiveness. Not a negativeness, a positiveness. And people don't want to, well, yeah, but if you're talking about your body unraveling, that's not positive. Well, no, not when you're experiencing it. That would be an insult and a stupid thing to say to anybody who's going through horror and pain as their bodies decline. But it is still, I think, perceptibly a becoming because there's always change. Always change means something is happening. Other things are coming. Things are changing. Things are moving. And movement isn't always a nice thing, but it is ultimately useful.
Yeah.
And unavoidable.
Right. Yeah. It's I think it's like we talked about, the focus of the becoming has to transcend the individual in order for it to continue to take on a connotation like that. So if we apply that to the universe, right, this idea of going from, becoming, and we look at what we know now about the physics of the universe, essentially the universe will follow a similar path to the human lifetime, right? As far as we know, right, is that it will continue to grow older and older, and eventually it will die. And like we said, we've talked about cyclical cosmologies, and they're not ruled out, but they're also not the scientific mainstream, right? The mainstream idea is that, there will be a heat death of the universe, and 100 trillion years from now, there will be nothing except for a diffuse energy state, and that's just the way it will be from that point on.
Except if that's how it was at the beginning.
Right.
And that's where those...
Yeah.
So we have a language thing going on here. First-rate language.
Yes.
Wrestling match.
And I hope that's not discouraging to listeners, but it is a good exercise in philosophy. It's that sometimes you just have to fight through these issues. And so that's the next question I had is, nowhere and nothing are different conceptually, but are they different in practically?
I think practically there's a relationship between them, and that's partly why we chose what we did for this thing that we do. It's because while I said last week that nowhere would indicate something cartographically unmapped or a space that is not identified or not considered valued. So it's uncharacterized in some way, and nothing is uncharacterized in some way. Both imply a process to characterize, to question, and therefore to understand, and perhaps to offer more of a description or more of a framework than existed before. It doesn't imply creating the whole thing. It just implies, well, okay. It's like I feel again sometimes with at play with my granddaughter who wants to build a castle or a structure, and we'll grab a couple of stones and put it together and maybe slap a little snow on it and say, "Okay, Grandpa, let's go do something else." And and so was the structure built? Well, rudimentarily, the beginnings of it are there, but that's what philosophy is.
Yeah.
We're put a couple more stones in the foundation. Over at a place near us, Geneseo, there's a great big stone wall, not tall, a stone wall around a large estate. And there has been this effort to preserve the historical aesthetic of that's low but substantial stone wall, and people volunteer. They go out and they add more stones. They add a little more mortar. They're shaping it. That's what we're doing.
Yeah, and some weeks we build a lot more than we can other weeks, and there's nothing that's harder to build than nothing. So we've struggled with it, but I think that when I'm thinking about the relationship between nowhere and nothing, one of the things we talked about in the nowhere episode was that actual nowhere means that you have nothing to navigate by. There's no landmarks.
Right.
That's what.
No stars, no landmarks.
Right. That's what sort of conceptually defines nowhere. But a lack of landmarks, you have to have nothing in order to have nowhere. Even though the one is talking about things and the one is talking about a place, if you have anything in a place, it is a landmark by which you could navigate, right? If you had a field, you could, you had a magnetic field, right? You'd know a direction. Or if you had, some piece of mass, you would have a landmark. So I think that in practice, they're probably not separate. If you had nothing, you would be nowhere, and if you were nowhere, there would be nothing.
Which I think, to be in all seriousness, is a state of being that many people find themselves in. One hopes temporarily, but on the topic of mental health, there's an awful lot of feeling sometimes nowhere, or sometimes having nothing to guide you or to cling to. So it becomes very psychological and not just physical object oriented. I think that the same thing holds true for finding something to help you navigate out of the nothingness or the nowhereness of the darkness.
Yeah, and I think that is can be integrated into the cyclical paradigm too, because I think that if you reach that point where you feel like you are nowhere in life or that you have nothing, usually that is the result of everything, right?
That has taken place.
Everything, yes. Yeah. Everything builds up to a fever pitch until it appears to be nothing, right?
Yeah.
But the one last interesting thing there, right? So we just talked about how nowhere and nothing, they seem to be
of a piece.
Integral. Yes. What do you think that does to time? Right? Because we have space-time, which is a single fabric. So if you are nowhere, you have no place, you have no thing, do you also have no time?
Seemingly. I'm off the cuff following you on this one. It's a good question. So let's pursue it. If you have in space-time, you have no discernible place or nothing around you, then what do we have? Well, the experiments of sensory deprivation, a loss of a sense of time takes place in those, at least from as I've read them over the years. So if you put yourself in a zone of complete flotation, utter darkness, without sound, then you probably don't know what time of day it is or how long you've been there. And I think that's an extreme example of something. Sometimes what happens to us if we're in a more positive way of composing music or making art or having company with somebody we really enjoy, we're not watching the clock. I mean, think of that as a phrase. If you don't watch the clock, you're not sure what time it is anymore. You lose track of time. You are willfully not wanting the markers.
Yeah, and that's interesting too, right? Because the difference between the positive and the negative, right?
Mm-hmm.
Between having no time and having no sense of time due to being in a flow state, or feeling like you have nothing or you're nowhere in life versus having a singular focus. And which is associated with a flow state or with a deep sense of meditative self-awareness, these sorts of things. It's almost hairline, right? The difference between nothing, we think of everything as being multitudinous, right? The sum total of everything. But I think that when we look at it on at least in an Eastern philosophical way or in a psychological health type of way, everything tends to be more conceptually associated with a unity of all things rather than a multitude of things. And so the unity of everything, right? And again, with Hegel, the absolute, that term seems to connote a unity of things. And I think that if you have a multitude of things, psychologically you tend to suffer. Or when you're viewing the metaphysics of the universe, you tend to become overwhelmed. And if you have nothing, then you are existentially in the depths of despair, right? There's nothing. But if you have everything focused into one thing, a unity, that tends to be where you see a lot of mystical and mental health tends to flourish in some ways.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting.
It
it makes me think of Loki, right? With the sacred timeline there. If you have no time, then nobody exists, and you're nowhere. You have nothing, right? But if you have all of these unpruned branches going off, then it's just chaos, right?
Now we're back to the chaos again.
If you have a unity of time, then there's a cohesiveness to it, right? And they go back and forth throughout the series, and whether the sacred timeline or the unpruned thing is what's right.
Because what happens to all those worlds that are destroyed in order for the sacred timeline to take place? It's a very interesting, it's pop culture, but it's very interesting what it does with that. And Eastern, and following, you've led me to another place with the Eastern idea or Middle Eastern idea, which is where Christianity and Judaism and the Muslim philosophies all came out of the same spot. Abandon what you have, give away what you have, and follow me. All of those kind of things. We have characters in our storytelling. I'm thinking of one now that's very popular from a group of novels that's called Reacher. It's about a person who was in the military and now he's just out. He literally. When somebody says unpack your luggage, he takes out his toothbrush and puts it down on a counter, and there's an exploration of this disconnectedness. When his friends, there's in a situation, I'm not going to spoil anything, but his former colleagues and friends ask him things, and he complains, how come everybody else has this picture of all of us and I don't? And they said, where do you hang a picture when you don't have a wall? And how are we to reach you? So he's Reacher, and it's hard to reach him, and he's a wandering figure by choice who's disconnected from almost everything, and yet has a sense of justice that is transforming him into something, or coalescing him into something that's not quite human.
Yeah, and I mean, bringing it back into like the real world, right? When they do imaging studies on expert meditators. I saw one just recently. They looked at a guy who had 23,000 hours, right? And they looked at the parts of the brain. You have separate parts of your brain that discern your point of view from how you view what other people's point of view is. And what they found is in this expert meditator, when he was looking at and thinking about other people, that part of the brain that lit up was the part that normally is the part that lights up when you're thinking about yourself. So again, taking the multiple, right? If you think of the whole world as 8 billion other separate people from you, right? This idea, or that there's nobody, right? So if there's nobody, nothing, nowhere, then you have existential dread. If you view everybody else as a separate thing, somebody that's separate from you and is out there, then it's just this frenzied chaos that you can't make sense of, right? But if you have that ability to look at everybody else and see some connection and see a unity, right? And to have some sort of shared concept of your health and your well-being on a singular level, that tends to be the better way of thinking about life, right? So there's a deep message in there. I'm not sure that we're completely capturing it, but again,
we can completely.
I think we've made a valiant effort, and we've gone in fits and starts. But like we said, a few minutes ago, there's nothing harder to talk about than nothing.
But I've had fun nothing with you.
Yeah, and I think that in future episodes, I think that for as difficult as this one has been to talk about, I think in future episodes it's definitely going to inform some of what we'll talk about down the road. So it's been a lot of fun regardless. And until next time, keep